Hi, my name is David Valdez, and I teach AP Human Geography at Cherry Creek High School in Greenwood Village, Colorado. Today's video will discuss how political power is expressed geographically as control over people, land, and resources, as illustrated by neocolonialism, shatterbelts, and choke points. So, what will we learn? Well, the political power of governments is expressed geographically as control over people, land, and resources. So, groups like the government control people, land, and resources through a concept known as territoriality. Many developed countries have exerted political, economic, and cultural power over developing countries in a process known as neocolonialism. Conflicts between larger political and cultural forces can cause regional problems in area known as shatterbelts. And choke points limit the access of people to the land and resources, making control of these access points crucial for countries. What is territoriality? Well, territoriality is the connection of people, their culture, and their economic systems to the land. So, groups will express their territoriality by delimiting or marking the boundaries of the area that they claim, by controlling the people and their activities inside the area that they claim, and defending the area that they claim from external groups. Territoriality can often lead to conflicts as groups disagree over borders, practice different cultures, or have competing economic interests in the area. Neocolonialism is when developed countries exert their economic power over developing countries. In many cases, it's not the developed countries' governments themselves that do this, but it's the transnational companies based in those developed countries that control the extraction of natural resources and the labor in former colonies. Good example of this is where foreign companies dominate oil extraction in the Middle East. Companies like BP, Exxon, and Total dominate the oil extraction while the local companies are left with very little to extract. Foreign companies also exploit cheap labor for factories in Southeast Asia, as seen by many different clothing manufacturers or other types of electronics manufacturing. One other way that foreign countries have exerted their economic power is by loaning money to the developing countries. The amounts that are loaned to the developing countries are so much that they are unable to pay them back, and they are kept in a constant cycle of debt. Developed countries also exert political and military power over those developing countries. Many developed countries have remained involved in political and military affairs of the developing countries to protect their own interests. An example of that is where the United States has intervened militarily in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Some of the developed countries have treated their former colonies to allow for military bases to be located inside of their countries. A good example of that is where France maintains many different military bases inside of West Africa. Additionally, developed countries exert cultural power over the developing countries. Many developing countries lose their language as the people are forced to learn the language of the colonizers who came in and dominated them politically, militarily, and economically. Additionally, groups like missionaries from global churches convert people in developing areas, which result in the loss of local cultural religious beliefs and in local cultural religions. Western clothing has also become the dominant form of dress worldwide, and so we will not see most people dressed in their traditional clothing as we might have seen a long time ago. A shatter belt is an area where larger regional or global political or cultural divisions collide and cause conflict at a local scale. So this is a global phenomenon affecting a local area. Good examples of this include when the Cold War political conflicts created shatter belts in places like Korea, as the UN fought communists over control of the peninsula. Also in Europe, where the Western and Eastern Europe divide came about as part of the Cold War, and in Vietnam, where the communists North Vietnamese fought the non communist South Vietnamese, and outside forces like the United States took interest in the war and participated as well. Religious conflicts created shatter belts in places like India and Pakistan because of the different religions that they have there. You'll also find religious shatter belts in places like Israel and the Caucasus region. Choke points are areas where the physical geography creates a narrow opening, like a strait, that makes it difficult for trade and other travel between 2 points. Important choke points include the Strait of Hormuz, which connects the Persian Gulf with the Arabian Sea. Also, the Strait of Gibraltar, which connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Mediterranean Strait. The Strait of Bosphorus connects the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea and provides access to southern Russia. And the Strait of Malacca is a strait that's in Indonesia that has the majority of trade flowing through that particular area. If you'd like to learn more about the conflict between the United States and Iran in the Strait of Hormuz, click on the QR code on the right. Let's practice. All right. Which of the following explains why the India-Pakistan region is considered a shatter belt? A. Both countries were once colonies of different European countries. B. The area is a buffer zone between Muslims and Hindus. C. India and Pakistan experienced conflict due to disputes between the two religions. D. India and Pakistan fragmented into new states due to internal tensions. Or E. India and Pakistan claim resources found in the region. The answer is C. India and Pakistan experienced conflict due to disputes between religions. What should we take away? Well, political power is expressed by groups and governments through their attempts to control people, their cultures, the land, and the resources for their own benefit. These attempts at political control often create conflict between the different groups, and they shape the state of the world today. Thank you for your time.
Hello and welcome back. I'm Ms. Patel, coming to you from Silver Spring, Maryland to teach you about topic 4.4, defining political boundaries. So in this video, I will talk about a lot of the different types of political boundaries that geographers use. So political boundaries are divisions of governance between states and within them that reflect balances of power that have been negotiated or imposed. So there are several types of political boundaries that we need to know in our class, including relic, superimposed, antecedent, geometric, subsequent, and consequent. So we're going to go through each of these, define them, give an example, and then at the end we'll practice them a little bit. So a relic boundary is a former boundary that no longer exists, but still has a major significance of some kind, usually cultural or economic significance. The most important example to know here is the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall is no longer an actual country border, but it was a part of the Iron Curtain and divided Europe during the Cold War for so long that there are still major economic inequalities between East and West, Berlin and larger Germany and larger Europe. So scale is really shown here. So this is an important example to know. Another type of boundary is a superimposed boundary. These are boundaries that are drawn by outside powers, and they completely ignore existing ethnic, cultural, any kind of existing social divisions between people. So, of course, a good example of this is almost all of Africa, since the Berlin Conference, when the European colonizers divided up Africa and just kind of like drew it in whichever way, they completely ignored these ethnic differences. So, for example, in Africa, there's a lot of different ethnic groups represented by each of these blue lines. But with colonization and decolonization, with the Europeans coming in and leaving, they just kind of arbitrarily drew the current country lines. And you can see on this graphic that sometimes those lines completely ignore ethnic groups. They might divide them up, push two ethnic groups together that shouldn't be, and that might cause conflict between those groups. And sometimes they just drew straight lines. I mean, they didn't bother to draw them according to the current divisions of people. So those are superimposed boundaries. Another type of boundary to know is antecedents. So these are very rare because they're drawn before there's much settlement in that area. Most of our political boundaries in the world are drawn way after people have been there for a long time in order for them to draw the boundaries later. So the closest example we can talk about is USA and Canada. Since most of that area was not settled, at least along the border, they just drew that line along a latitude, and we'll get to this in a further example in a second. And then eventually, as people settled in both countries, it became the countries we know today, with the provinces and states eventually after that. So a geometric boundary is a boundary that follows some kind of straight line, usually a longitude or a latitude. So they can also be superimposed or antecedent, as we just saw. So we're going to see some repetitive examples. So USA Canada is definitely an example of this, since they really just drew the latitude line along, or the borderline along the latitude of the 49th parallel. If you scan that QR code, it's actually a very interesting border, and that video tells you more about it. Another example of a geometric boundary are the superimposed geometric boundaries in Northern Africa, where they just ignored those ethnic groups, just drew the straight line. So that's another example. And one more, many of the US states out west, they just drew straight lines in order to draw those last states. A subsequent boundary is a boundary that's drawn where people have already settled and established some kind of culture there. So this is the opposite of antecedent, because there's people there when the lines are drawn. A lot of Europe, it's not perfect, but much of Europe is drawn this way, since a lot of the same speakers of a language live in one country, and it's very divided up by the different ethnic groups and different languages. At least eventually it was gotten correct. I mean, it's changed many times over the history, but for the most part, a lot of Europe is subsequent boundaries. Consequent boundaries are very similar to subsequent boundaries. They're kind of considered a subset, where they are drawn after people are there, but they're drawn in consequence of something happening, or to accommodate some kind of group of some kind, like a certain ethnic group or a war that happened. So here's some good examples of that. First, we have the Balkans after Yugoslavia. Since Yugoslavia broke up, it kind of split apart into each of their individual nation groups. So those country lines are drawn according to those nations. India and Pakistan, when the British drew those lines, was partially to make sure that Hindus and Muslims were not killing each other. So they tried to separate them into their own countries. And more recently, an example, in 1999, the Canadian government gave the province of Nunavut a lot more autonomy by giving them, their own territory, which was to help the indigenous Inuit people that live there. So let's just practice this real quick by looking at an FRQ. You can pause this to read the whole thing, since we are only going to be doing part B. So part B asks you to describe 3 political or cultural consequences of superimposed boundaries in Africa. This is a common thing they want you to be able to do. So these are just some of the available answers that are on the rubric. So as we know, those superimposed boundaries can break ethnic groups apart. They can shove ethnic groups together, which might cause war or even war within a country. It could be civil war or war between two different countries. And even worse, it could make us lose languages since we're separating groups and they're not maybe no longer able to practice their language since they've switched to the colonizer language, or set up a completely ineffective economic or political system. So, what's important to take away? Distinguishing between the different types of boundaries, political boundaries, with both definitions and examples is very important. It's also super important to be able to explain consequences, both consequences and causes that are social, economic, and political of a lot of these boundaries, and be able to use a map to explain it. That's a common thing that you should be able to do. So remember to go out and find the good in the world, and thank you for listening.